Hello grade 10s. This is lesson 3, week 16, and we're looking at the uptake of water by roots. Now the first thing you need to remember is that water needs to get from outside the root into the plant, and it has to move through the cortex quite some distance before it ends up in the xylem. So this passage, this uptake, this working of the way the water through the plant into the xylem, that is what concerns us today. We're looking at this whole process. The first very important structure as we look at this process is the structure of the root hair. Now, root hairs, if you recall, when we started learning about epidermal tissue right back in week 11, we said that certain epidermal cells can be modified, and one of the modifications of an epidermal cell is that it can have a root hair. Of course, it has to be growing in the root. Now, the epidermal cells that face the surface of the cell that faces outwards, so we're looking at that surface, for example, is going to be the surface that absorbs water. But we can see that the surface area of this plant cell, this epidermal cell, is limited. If we try and draw it in 3 dimensions, we've only got that amount of surface area for the uptake of water. However, if we were to enlarge our cell by putting a projection onto our cell, what we've suddenly done here is we've extended the surface area. Now water is not only going to be absorbed over the surface area, the flat surface area, but water can be absorbed over the whole surface area of this extension to the cell. So what we've done is increase the surface area in order to increase the uptake of water by the roots. And these little root hairs, these unicellular root hairs, are very, very sensitive. One of the things that they're sensitive to is any acid in the water. Acid in the soil or acid in the water, usually due to the effects of acid rain, can cause these very delicate little root hairs to become damaged. That is one of the ways in which acid rain affects plants, is that the root hairs are killed. This diagram shows us from the soil outside the plant. Here is the edge of the root, and here is, let's label it here, the xylem. So we're going to see the root that water takes from outside in the soil into the plant and all the way to the xylem tissue. And once the water is in the xylem tissue, it's going to be able to move upwards, up the stem, and that we will talk about tomorrow. But it's first got to get into the stem. This, of course, is the root hair that we've been talking about, and you can see how it extends the surface area. Here is a normal epidermal cell, and you can see that the root hair extends the surface area of the water cell for increased uptake of water. Now, how is the water going to move from the soil into the cytoplasm of the epidermal cell. Well, what way of transporting water across a membrane have you learnt about? Do you remember that some weeks ago, in fact, quite a few weeks ago, I'm just having a look here, we're looking at week number 6. In week number 6, 10 weeks ago, you learned about the process called osmosis. And osmosis moved water from an area of, let's put square brackets around to show that it's water concentration, high water concentration, through a membrane to an area of lower water concentration. And the word that we used for water concentration was water potential. So the water moves from an area of high, and this is the sign for water potential, high water potential, to an area of lower water potential through a semi-permeable membrane. Now this is what happens here in the root hair. There's lots of water in the soil, high water potential in the soil, low water potential inside the cytoplasm, and so water osmoses into the cell. And we can see this path of water. It's moving from cell to cell. It's crossing over the cell membranes. It's moving through the pores of the cell wall into the cell, and it moves from cell to cell, until it finally ends up in the xylem. This movement of water from cell to cell is known as symplastic movement. It moves inside the cell, in the symplast of the cell. Symplastic movement of water, or the water moves in the symplast of the cell. So this pathway is known as symplasty, from cell to cell. But there is another way that the water can move, and that is in between the cells. I think I need to choose a different color here. Let's choose this bright pink. In between the cells. So the water doesn't actually enter the cells. It's moving from intercellular space to intercellular space, and it moves between the cells. And finally, it's going to find its way into the xylem. It's not entering the cells at all. It's traveling between the cell walls, and this pathway of water is known as apoplasty. The water moves through the apoplast. So symplast is in the cells. Apoplast is between the cells, in between the spaces of the cells. And all the time water is moving, let's do this very clearly, from an area of high water potential to an area of low water potential. The water ends up in the xylem, and that is where our lesson tomorrow will pick up, when we see what happens to the water now that it's in the xylem. How does it get up the stem? Here is your homework. What is water potential? What is osmosis? What is the symplastic movement of water? What is the apoplastic movement of water? What is water potential? Remember, we use that sign to show us water potential. Water potential basically refers to the concentration of water molecules in comparison or relative to solutes that might be dissolved in the water. The purer the water is, the higher the water potential. The more dissolved solutes there are in the water, the lower the water potential. And so osmosis is the movement of water from an area of high water potential to an area of lower water potential through a semi-permeable membrane. What is the symplastic movement of water? That is from cell to cell, when the water enters into the cell and moves from cell to cell through the plant. What is the apoplastic movement of water? That is when movement of water occurs between cells. So instead of the water going from cell to cell, as we showed here with symplastic movement, the water goes in between the cells without actually entering them. And that's it for today, grade 10s. Join me again tomorrow. Goodbye.